What would you do if the sanctuary you built with your own two hands, the only place that truly felt like home, was ripped away from you, not by fate, but by a calculated, malicious act of envy? The morning mist still clung to the petals of the hydrangeas when the sound of boots crushing gravel shattered the peace. Tu Tien stood in the center of her garden, a basket of fresh greens in her arms, unaware that her life was about to be turned upside down. She didn't hear the engine roar until it was too late. She didn't see the shadows creeping through the old wooden gate until the first snap of a broken stem echoed like a gunshot in the morning air. Why would someone go to such lengths to destroy a simple garden? Who could possibly benefit from seeing the light fade from a woman's eyes? And where, in this moment of absolute violation, was the man who had promised to protect her? The air grew heavy with the scent of crushed jasmine and damp earth. Three men, their faces hardened by years of petty cruelty, didn't come to argue. They came to erase. They moved with the cold, rhythmic precision of those hired to break spirits. With every heavy, deliberate step, Tu Tien's labor of love, the vibrant greens, the delicate blossoms vanished under layers of mud and wreckage. Tu Tien dropped her basket, the sound muffled by the damp soil, her breath hitched. For a second, she couldn't move. She couldn't process the sheer, senseless violence unfolding before her. Then, the instinct to protect the only thing she had left took over. She rushed forward, her hands trembling as she tried to block their path, a desperate, fragile barrier against an unstoppable force. "Stop it, please stop." Her voice was a cracked whisper, barely audible over the sound of snapping stalks and laughter. One of the men sneered, a jagged, ugly expression that didn't reach his cold eyes. With a callous shove, he pushed her aside. Tu Tien hit the ground hard, the sharp stones of the garden path biting into her palms. Her skin was scraped, her clothes stained, but the pain in her body was nothing compared to the sight of her roses, the ones she had nursed through the frost, being trampled into the dirt. The sound of her cry, a raw, jagged sound of pure heartbreak, pierced the morning air. It was a cry that didn't just call for help. It shattered the stillness of the estate. Deep inside the main house, Jack heard it. He didn't need to be told what was happening. The intensity of that scream, the sheer terror in it, acted like a physical blow to his chest. Jack moved with a velocity that defied his usual composed demeanor. He didn't run. He exploded into motion, his expression shifting from calm authority to a cold, razor-sharp fury. He reached the garden in seconds, his boots thundering against the gravel. When he saw them, the men standing over Tu Tien, the wreckage of her world strewn across the ground, a vein throbbed at his temple. "Get off my property." Jack's voice was a low, dangerous rumble, the sound of a CEO whose boundaries had been crossed in the most unforgivable way. "Touch her again, and I swear you won't leave this gate on your own 2 feet." The men paused. They looked at Jack, standing there in his crisp shirt, his eyes burning with an authority that usually made boardrooms tremble. For a fleeting second, they faltered, but then one of the thugs smirked, leaning back and pulling a cigarette from his pocket. He didn't care about the suit. He didn't care about the bank balance. He had been paid handsomely by Ba Dep, and he had his instructions: leave nothing behind. "You heard the man," the thug muttered, spitting on the ground. He turned back to the remaining flower beds, his heel grinding a marigold into the mud. Jack stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. He was a man who moved mountains with a signature, who solved creases with a phone call. He was used to being the smartest man in the room, the one with all the answers. But here, in the dirt, face to face with mindless, hired malice, his influence felt hollow. He reached for his phone, his mind racing. Who could he call? Who could stop this? But the thugs didn't care about the police, and they certainly didn't care about his reputation. They were Ghost's hired hands, meant to deliver a message of pure, unadulterated hate. Jack realized, with a sickening jolt of clarity, that he was powerless. He reached down, his hands hovering over Tu Tien's shoulders as he tried to pull her up, but she stayed rooted, her eyes fixed on the devastation. She wasn't just looking at broken plants, she was looking at the end of her peace. She was looking at the realization that no matter how hard she worked or how good her intentions were, there would always be someone like Ba Dep waiting in the shadows to take it all away. Tu Tien, look at me, Jack urged, his voice thick with a mixture of helplessness and raw protective rage. Don't look at it, just look at me. She couldn't. Her tears flowed freely now, washing away the dirt on her cheeks. She was shaking not from the fall, but from the violation. Every time she tried to stand, her legs gave way. She felt as though the very ground she stood on had betrayed her. And all the while, from a distance hidden behind the thick foliage of the garden wall, a figure watched. Ba Dep stood with her arms crossed, a thin, satisfied smile. She wasn't just destroying a garden, she was dismantling the only thing that made Tu Tien feel worthy. She watched as Jack, the untouchable CEO, stood by, his face twisted in a mask of impotent rage. She felt a surge of triumph. Money could buy power, but it couldn't buy protection from people who were willing to destroy everything just to watch someone else hurt. Jack felt the weight of it all, the frustration of a man who built empires but couldn't keep a flower from being crushed. He pulled Tu Tien into his chest, shielding her eyes from the sight, his arms wrapping around her like a cage. He held her tight, his heart hammering against her shoulder. He wanted to shout. He wanted to strike out. He wanted to tear the world apart to make this right. But he couldn't. He could only stand there, a pillar of strength turning to stone in the face of such senseless, petty destruction. He could feel her shuddering against him, her sobs muffled by his jacket. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. There were no words. He simply held on, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the men who were still moving through the garden, methodically pulling up the last of the saplings. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The only sounds were the soft crunch of soil, the occasional snap of a stem, and Tu Tien's uneven breathing. Jack's mind was moving at 1,000 miles an hour, cataloging faces, calculating moves, and realizing the depth of the trap. He looked over the top of Tu Tien's head, his eyes scanning the perimeter. He knew who was behind this. He could feel the cold, calculated influence of Ba Dep lingering in the air. This wasn't just a random act of vandalism. It was a surgical strike at the heart of their life together. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. He looked down at his hands, the hands that built companies, that signed contracts, that dictated the flow of money across the city, and realized they were useless here. He couldn't trade his way out of this pain. He couldn't negotiate with the cruelty that drove these men. He leaned down, his voice barely a whisper against her ear. We're leaving. Now. Let them have it. It's just dirt, Tu Tien. It's just plants. We can build it again. But Tu Tien shook her head, her hand grasping at the hem of his jacket. It's not just plants, Jack. She gasped, her voice barely a thread. It's the only place I felt safe. The truth of her words hit Jack harder than any physical blow. The garden hadn't been just a hobby. It had been an anchor. It was the only part of her life that hadn't been touched by the drama, the gossip, and the endless, suffocating scrutiny of his world. And now, it was gone. He gripped her tighter, feeling her pain seep into his own skin. He realized in that moment that he had been so busy building a fortress to keep her safe from the world that he hadn't noticed the rot growing from within. He had been looking at the boardrooms, the bank statements, and the rivals, while the real danger was growing in the quiet, simple places he thought were secure. He looked back at the thugs. One of them stopped, looked directly at Jack, and let out a cold, sharp laugh. It was a challenge, a direct, taunting display of the power they held in this moment. Jack didn't break eye contact. He didn't look away. Instead, he pulled his phone out with one hand while keeping his other arm locked firmly around Tu Tien. He didn't dial the police. He knew the procedure. He knew the wait times. He knew how these things played out. He dialed his security lead. "I need an extraction team at the south gate, now. And I need a full sweep of the perimeter. If anyone is watching, I want them identified. No, don't follow them. Just identify them." His voice was steady, cold, and final. The thugs, sensing that the game had shifted, began to slow their pace. They had done the damage. They had delivered the message. They didn't need to stay for the aftermath. Without another word, they turned and headed toward the back fence, moving with the same practiced ease they had shown upon arrival. They disappeared into the trees as quickly as they had come, leaving behind a scared, desolate landscape that used to be a paradise. The silence that returned to the garden was different now. It wasn't the peaceful silence of the morning. It was the hollow, ringing silence of a crime scene. The dew was still on the ground, but it was mixed with the mud of the destruction. Tu Tien finally stood up, though she leaned heavily against Jack for support. She walked slowly through the ruins of her garden. She didn't cry anymore. Her face was set in a mask of numb, hollow exhaustion. She touched a broken stalk of a rose, her fingers tracing the jagged edge where it had been snapped. Jack followed her, giving her the space she needed, his eyes scanning every shadow, every tree line. He was waiting. He was ready. But he knew it wouldn't be that easy. He walked up behind her, gently taking her hand. His skin was warm, a stark contrast to the cold, dead plants surrounding them. He didn't promise her justice. He didn't promise her that it wouldn't happen again. He knew the world they lived in, and he knew that for as long as they were together, there would be people like Ba Dep trying to claw their way into their lives. "I didn't protect it," he said, his voice raw. It was the first time he had ever admitted such a thing to her. The CEO, the man who could move mountains, had failed to protect her patch of earth. Tu Tien turned, looking at him. Her eyes were red, swollen, and filled with a sorrow that cut straight to his soul. But she didn't blame him. She saw the desperation in his gaze, the way he was physically vibrating with the need to shield her. "You're here, Jack," she said, her voice soft. "That's what matters." She reached up, her fingers brushing the tension from his brow. It was a gesture of such profound, quiet love that Jack felt his knees go weak. In the middle of all this destruction, amidst the mud and the broken stems, she was the one offering him comfort. He pulled her into his arms again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just about protection. It was about surrender. He pressed his face into her hair, breathing in the scent of her, the only thing that felt real and pure in a world that was constantly trying to tear them apart. They stood there for a long time, two people standing in the ruins of their own life, deciding whether to run or to rebuild. From the shadows, Ba Dep watched, her grip on the iron gate tightening until her knuckles turned white. She had wanted to see them break. She had wanted to see the cracks in their relationship, the finger-pointing, the blame. She wanted to see Jack turn away from the mess, or Tu Tien turn away from him. Instead, she saw something else. She saw a bond that had been tempered, not broken, by the violence. She saw a man who had stopped acting like a CEO and started acting like a partner. And she saw a woman who, despite having lost everything she had worked for, hadn't lost her dignity. It was a sight that terrified her more than any threat Jack could have made. As they walked away from the garden, hand in hand, Jack didn't look back at the devastation. He looked forward. He didn't need to see the destruction to know what had been done. He already had the image burned into his mind, a blueprint for the future. He led her back toward the house, his steps steady, his posture rigid. Every motion was calculated. Every decision from this point forward would be aimed at one thing: securing their world. The drama wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. But as they crossed the threshold of their home, Jack knew that the power dynamics had fundamentally shifted. He wasn't the CEO of a company anymore. He was the guardian of a life. And he would sacrifice everything: his reputation, his fortune, his control, to ensure that no one ever touched that life again. Inside the house, the light was soft and warm, a complete contrast to the chaos outside. Jack guided her to the kitchen, his movements gentle as he poured a glass of water. He was watching her, tracking every flutter of her eyelids, every tremble in her hands. "I'm going to have the whole place remodeled," he said, his voice calm, but with an underlying edge of steel. "I'm hiring a new security firm. Dos Cuatro. Our surveillance. I don't care how much it costs." Tu Tien looked at the water, then up at him. She saw the fire in his eyes, not the angry, unfocused fire from the garden, but a new, focused, cold heat. "Jack," she whispered, "it's just a garden." "It's our sanctuary," he countered, his voice firm, "and I'm never going to let anyone destroy it again." He sat down across from her, his hands clasped together on the table. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distance. He was thinking about Ba Dep. He was thinking about the way she had smiled when he saw her yesterday in the lobby. He was thinking about the subtle threats, the veiled comments. He had let it slide because he thought it was beneath him. He was done being the bigger person. "I have something I need to do," he said, standing up. "But I need you to promise me something first." Tu Tien looked at him, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" "Stay inside. Don't go to the garden. Don't go to the gate. I have security at every entrance. Just stay safe." She nodded slowly, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. Jack leaned down, pressing a lingering, desperate kiss to her forehead. It was a promise, a vow, and a goodbye all in one. He turned and walked out the door, his steps firm, his jaw tight. He wasn't going to call a lawyer. He wasn't going to file a report. He was going to handle this the only way that people like Ba Dep understood. As the door clicked shut behind him, the house felt strangely quiet. Tu Tien sat alone in the kitchen, the sunlight streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Outside, the world was still broken. The garden was still a ruin. But for the first time, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a catalyst. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had planted those seeds, the hands that had nurtured those flowers. She thought about the time, the effort, the patience it took to grow something from nothing. And she realized that she hadn't just grown plants. She had grown a life, and that life was stronger than any amount of mud or spite. A small, sad smile touched her lips. She could feel the weight of the change, the crushing burden of the events that had unfolded, but beneath it all, there was a core of iron. She wouldn't just rebuild the garden. She would grow something that could survive the frost. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the trees that hadn't been touched. A few petals drifted through the open window, landing on the table like tiny, colorful teardrops. She reached out and brushed them away, her movements deliberate. The story wasn't over. The game had changed, and the stakes had been raised to a level that no one had anticipated. Jack would do what he had to do, and she would do what she had to do. They were a team, now more than ever, forged in the fires of a day that had changed everything. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the yard, Tu Tien stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the broken garden one last time. It was a mess. It was a tragedy. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen because it proved that she was capable of creating, even when the world was determined to destroy. The phone on the table buzzed a message from an unknown number. She picked it up, her breath hitching. "This is just the beginning, Tu Tien. You can't hide behind his money forever." She deleted the message without a second thought. She didn't need to hide. She didn't need to fear. She simply turned off the phone, set it down, and waited for Jack to return. The night was coming, and with it, the answers to all the questions that had been left hanging in the air. The open loops of the day, the identity of the attackers, the extent of Badep's reach, the depth of Jack's resolve would all be closed soon. She took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs with the scent of ozone and coming rain. Whatever was coming next, she was ready. The garden might have been destroyed, but the roots were deep and they were still alive. And in the morning, when the sun rose, they would find out just how deep those roots really went. The drama had only just begun. The question was, who would be left standing when the dust finally settled? The answer was already written in the silence of the room, in the strength of their bond, and in the unspoken promise that no matter what happened, they would face it together. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the stakes had never been higher. The final act was about to begin, and it would be a spectacle that would echo long after the last flower had bloomed or been crushed in the wake of the storm.